Okay, asks Nistonagok Otakshkitope. Ikitamics. Hello, students. It's Otakshkitope. It's a good day. Okay, and today I'm going to teach you how to count. So, today we're going to talk about numbers. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so Blackfeet language needs with me. All right. This is lesson 5, and we're going to talk about numbers. And in this lesson, we're just going to learn how to count, learn about the numbers and how to use these numbers. And it's not going to teach all there is to about numbers. It's just about 1 to 100 and some basic things. Okay. Numbers/letters. The word okstaki in Blackfeet means to count, but it also means to read. And so when we're talking about counting and reading, it's the same word. So that's why the word okstaksist is the same for a number and a letter. So number 1 is nitukska, 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 nitukska. Number 2, natuka, natuka, natuka. Number 3, nyukska, 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 nyukska. And when you're pronouncing this, it may look intimidating to pronounce, but it's pronounced like nyo, kind of. Nyukska. You can get away with nyukska, but it's nyukska. 4, nisu, 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 nisu. 5, nisitu, nisitu, nisitu. 6, noi, noi, noi. Or you can just say noi, noi. 7, ishkitsika, ishkitsika, ishkitsika. And although it might not look like there's anything in the front, you don't want to pronounce it gitsika. It's ishkitsika, ishkitsika, ishkitsika. If you cannot pronounce this ish, then you can just substitute it by putting an I sound in front and just say ikitsika, ikitsika, but it should be ishkitsika. Next up is 8. Nanisu, nanisu, nanisu. 9, bishksu, bishksu, bishksu. 10, gibu, gibu, gibu. Okay, achkon noch po katok stakyope. Let's count again from the beginning. Let's count again. Nitukska, natuka, niukska, nisu, nisitu, noi, ishkitsika, nanisu, bishksu, and gibu. Okay. So now let's count past 10. How do we count past 10? Well, you're going to take a number prefix and add gupatu. Gupatu. And gupatu basically means more than. And so when you're counting in the teens, you're basically taking these prefixes and then adding more than. So when you say numbers such as 18, you're really saying 8 more than, or like 8 more than 10. But let's first look at the number prefixes. And they're pretty similar. You just basically take the first part of the letter. For instance, 1, nitsi, it comes from nitukska. So you could see where it comes from, nitsi. 2, Nazi, Nazi, Nazi. 3, Ni, Ni, Ni. And if you have trouble remembering any of these prefixes, just think of the first syllable of the numbers 1 to 10, and that's pretty much it, except for one like 3. Actually, no, even with 3. Ni comes from niukska. 4, same thing, nis from nisu. Nisi, nisi, nisi. 5, nisitsi, nisitsi, nisitsi. As you can see, it comes from nisitu, nisitsi. 6. This one is a little bit different from Norway, but still pretty similar. Nei, nei, nei. 7, ishkitsikki, ishkitsikki, ishkitsikki. 8, nanisi, nanisi, from nanisu, nanisi. 9, bishksi, bishksi, bishksi. And then 10 is gipe, gipe, gipe. And you don't really have to worry about remembering the prefix for 10 because you don't really use it until you're counting past 1 to 99. So you only use it in the hundreds, thousands, and whatnot. But yeah, just to reiterate, all of these are the prefixes and they derive from the numbers 1 to 10. And we use these prefixes to count past 10, or just to, not even that, just we use it when talking about numbers. And I'll explain more what that means. So for instance, if you were to take the prefix for 4, which is nisi, and add kuputtu, you get nisi kuputtu, which is 14. And that's an example of how you can count in the teens. So you use these prefixes that correspond to the numbers, and you add kuputtu, which means more than. So when you say nisi kuputtu, you're kind of saying 4 more than, and then just 10 is just kind of implied. So 14 is 4 more than 10. That's how we count in Blackfoot. Nisi kuputtu. Another example is if you take the prefix for 8, which is nanisi, nanisi, and add it to kuputtu, you get nanisi kuputtu, nanisi kuputtu, nanisi kuputtu, which would be 18, nanisi kuputtu. So make sense where that you count in the teens. You just take any of these and add kuputtu. So let's just really quickly count from 11 to 19 using these. Nitsi kuputtu is 11. Natsi kuputtu, 12. Niyi kuputtu, 13. Nisi kuputtu, 14. Nisitsi kuputtu, 15. Nei kuputtu, 16. Ishkitsikki kuputtu, 17. Nanitsi kuputtu, 18. Ishksi kuputtu is 19. And then gipi kuputtu is 10. It's not a word. And now you can count by tens. And so it's the same concept. You use these number prefixes and then add bu, 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 and make sure to pronounce it as ba, bu. And it derives from the word gi bu, which is 10. So essentially when you're counting, you're saying 2 tens, 3 tens, 4 tens, whatnot. So another example is, and what I mean by counting by tens is, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, so on. If we take the prefix for 2, which is Nazi, then we get, and add it to bu, get Nazi bu, which is 20. Nazi bu, Nazi bu. If we take the prefix for 4, for instance, and nisi, naditapu, get nisipu, nisipu, nisipu. If you take the prefix for 8, which is nanisi, nanisi, and add it to bu, get nanisipu, nanisipu, which is 80, nanisipu. Do you understand? And so, just to reiterate, in case it doesn't make sense, when you're counting from teens, which is 11 to 19, you're taking the prefixes that we went over and adding it to gupatu. And then when you're counting by tens, you take the same prefixes, but add bu. So for instance, nanisipu is kind of like saying 8 tens. And then if we're counting past tens, and I'm not really sure how to explain it, but it's the numbers between the tens. For instance, 24. It's pretty much the same as what we just learned. So you just add the numbers. So essentially, when you're counting numbers such as 24, you're saying 20 and then 4 more than. So you're saying the base number first, which would be 20, and then you're saying the not sure, for lack of a better term, the smaller number, for instance 4, and then you just add them together. So the first part of a number, say like 24, you take the number prefix, which would be 2, and then bu, which makes it 20. And then for the second part, you take the number prefix, which would be 4, and then you add gupatu, which, as we learned, means more than. So when you're saying 24 in Blackfeet, you are essentially saying 20 and 4 more than, which would be natsipu nisikuputu. And if it helps you to think about it, you can break it apart into 2. You can look at the word for 20, which would be natsipu, and the word for 14, which would be nisikuputu. And so to say 24, you say natsipu nisikuputu. And it might seem strange that to say 24, you'd say 20 and 14. You know, you'd think that that'd be 34, but remember, don't think nisikuputu solely as 14, think of it as 4 more than. And so it's not necessarily 14, it's just saying that it's 4 more than 20. Natsipu nisikuputu. For numbers such as 48, again, you take the word for 40, nisipu, and then you add the word for 18, nanisikuputu. So really 48 is translating as 4 tens and then 8 more. Nisipu nanisikuputu. Nisipu nanisikuputu. And at first, when you're counting, it might really seem odd that you're using nanisikuputu to say like 48, even though we just learned nanisikuputu means 18. But even in Blackfeet, that happens a lot. It doesn't really make sense if you were to break it apart, but don't look at it as the parts. Don't look at it as nanisikuputu and nisipu. Look at it as a total of nisipu, nanisikuputu. Because if you start to break apart each part, then it doesn't really make sense. So you have to consider it as a whole rather than the parts. Another example is, for instance, 73. You could say ishkitsikipu, word for 70, and then niyikuputu, which is the word for 13. Ishkitsikipu niyikuputu. Ishkitsikipu niyikuputu. 73. Ishkitsikipu niyikuputu. 7 tens and 3 more. And how else can you use numbers? Well, if you use it when you're talking about people, then it's a little bit different. You can't just say nituk ka natuk ka, or you can't just say, if you're talking about 20 people, you can't just say natsipo. If you're talking about 7 people, you can't really just say ishkitsika. There's a format for when you're talking about people. And the format is pretty simple. You just take the, when you're talking about matapi, which is a person, you take the number prefix, which we have learned, and then you add it to tapi, which comes from the word matapi, which means person or people. And let me just show you. For instance, if we take the prefix for one, nitsi, and add tapi, you get nitsi tapi, which means one person. But be careful when you're pronouncing this word, because it can be confused with the word nitsi tapi, which is what us Blackfeet call ourselves, which translates to like the real people. So this is pronounced nitsi tapi, and just don't mix it up with nitsi tapi. They sound pretty similar, and depending on who's pronouncing the words, they are the same. So just keep in mind up for that. But yeah, nitsi tapi is one person. If you take the prefix for two, which is Nazi, you could get Nazi tapi, which is two people. Nazi tapi. And but more so, when you say Nazi tapi, you're not necessarily saying two people so much as you're saying there are two people, like there exists two people. Nazi tapi. So even though it is just two people, you're more so saying there are two people. Nazi tapi. An example of how you could use this is if you take the word ninna, or rather the word ninnakes, which is men. If you wanted to say like two men, you'd say Nazi tapi ninnakes. Nazi tapi ninnakes, which is basically saying two people are men, if that makes sense. That's just how we count people in Blackfeet. We first talk about how many people, and then we talk about the people, if that makes sense. So when you want to say something like two men, in reality, you're saying two people are men. Nazi tapi ninnakes. Of course, you could get away with saying something like natuka ninnakes, to say two people, natuka ninnakes. And it would make sense, but it's just not really correct. So the proper way to say like two men is Nazi tapi ninnakes. Well, not that natuka ninnakes is improper, it's just, you know, you can get away with it, so it's not necessarily improper, it's just not how Blackfeet normally works. Because if you just say natuka ninnakes, then you're kind of speaking Blackfeet like you would speak English. Another instance of how we talk about people is like with children. To say something like I have two children, you say Nazi tapi noko six, and noko six literally means my children. And so when you want to talk about children, you don't really say I have, you say two people are my children, basically. Nazi tapi noko six. Nazi tapi noko six. Two people are my children. And the same thing, we'll learn about it in another lesson, but if you want to ask like how many children somebody has, you say tsanitsi tapi, which means like how many people. Tsanitsi tapi. How many people are your children? Oh, natsi tapi noko six. Two people. And then when you're talking about animals, this is kind of when you can use the numbers themselves. You just add an M. So if we, for instance, take nidukska, we just add an M to get nidukskam. You know, for instance, nidukskam, one of something. And this is when you're talking about animals. Nidukskam, nidukskam. And again, it isn't so much one animal as it is saying like there is one animal. Or you take natuka and get natukam to say there are two of an animal. Natukam. For instance, you could say Natukam imitates. Natukam imitates. Natukam imitates means there are two dogs. Natukam imitates. There are two dogs. And then imitates means dogs, comes from the word imita, which means dog. And so that's how you talk about animals. You just take the number, counting numbers, and then add an M, and then whatever you're talking about. For instance, take the word for a cat, buas. The plural of cat would be buasix. So if you wanted to say something like, there are 4 cats, you take the word for 4, which is ni su, and just add M. Ni sum. Ni sum means there are 4. And then buasix, which means cats. So if you wanted to say there are 4 cats, or just 4 cats, you could say ni sume buasix. Just, as there are 2 dogs, not to come imitate. And again, can't stress this enough, with this format is more so saying there are 2 dogs than it is saying just 2 dogs. Because if like 2 dogs was a name or something, then it would be translated differently. Then you would just use the number prefixes and just say Nazi, which is 2. Nazi imitate. Or Natsimeta, mean 2 dog. And then when you're talking about objects, you're just taking the number and then you're adding yi. For instance, you take nidukska, you get nidukskai, nidukskai. And you could pronounce it all the way and say nidukskai, but a lot of people kind of shorten it to just say nidukskai, which is pretty much the same thing as saying nidukskai, just kind of shortened, nidukskai. You take 2, natuka, get natukai, or natukai, not either one, natukai or natukai. I will say it is more common to say nidukskai, natukai, niukskai than it is to just say like nidukskai, natukai, or niukskai. But yeah, not niukskai. So these are examples of when you're talking about there are 3 of something, there are 2 of something, there's 1 of something. Hanya. For instance, you could say niukskai otakist. There are 3 circles. Niukskai otakist. If we take the word sanakyatsis, which means book, you can change it to sanakyatsis, which means books. If you want to say there are 3 books, you could say niukskai sanakyatsis. Niukskai sanakyatsis. Take the word for there are 2 of something, natukai. You could say natukai supatsis. Natukai supatsis. Natukai supatsis. Which means there are 2 chairs. Supatsis means chair. Supatsis means chairs, plural. And then you could say something like nitukskai. Nitukskai, there's 1. Nitukskai kakatusi. Nitukskai kakatusi. Nitukskai kakatusi. Which means there's 1 star. Nitukskai kakatusi. So kakatusi means star. Okay. So one last time before we go, let's count from 1 to 10, just to jog your memory. So you got nitukska, natuka, niukska, nisu, nisitu, noi, ishkitsikka, nanisu, bishksu, gibu. Genye. Done with the lesson. Okay. Gedakramat sinokbuao. Gedakramat so estates matokbuao. I'll see you guys later and I'll teach you guys later. Larit. Again, to the end.